already running amok by the time I was his age. And so I felt like the Lord was saying, you need to sit down and talk to him. And because he lost his mom. Some of you know that Beth, she passed from breast cancer, and it's been real hard. So I had an opportunity to sit down and talk to him the other day, man to man, for the first time, I guess you would say, man to man. But our kids are the target, you guys. That's Satan's target, is our children. And so we want to be vigilant, and we want to keep our eyes open, and we don't want to fall asleep at the wheel. We have to keep the faith, and we have to not be afraid to share it. We're going to get to go over here next Saturday coming up and be in this school over here, and we're going to represent the church, and we're going to have a booth and music, and it's going to be a wonderful thing. I want to be a witness. I want to be a light. I want to be an example over there. So before we open up here, just keep that day in prayer for me, if you will, so that there will be some soft hearts that will be blessed by what we're doing over there, and maybe come and link up with us. That would be great. So anyway, that's my little spiel. Let's open up to chapter 9 of 1 Kings. I get really heavy-hearted sometimes when I think about this stuff, and it's difficult. I don't know about you guys, but for me it's difficult to know what file to put this in. You know, I want to get mad. I want to get radical. I want to rebel. But I know that, the Lord's saying, no, you can't do it like that. You have to do it through love and truth and the power of prayer. That's right. Very, very important. So, all right. So let's take a look at this. These couple chapters that we have before us this evening. We're going to start in chapter 9, verse 1. So when Solomon finished building the temple of the Lord, the royal place, and all that Solomon desired to do, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, just he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and petition that you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple you have built to put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there at all times. And as for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, with a heart of integrity and in what is right, doing everything I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and ordinances, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised your father David. You will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. So the second appearance here of the Lord to Solomon. You can imagine that the first time the Lord appeared to Solomon, what an awesome experience that would have had to have been for him. How many of us would like to have something like that happen in our lives, even if it's a cloud or however he chooses to appear, but to have that awesome, powerful experience, with God, what an awesome thing to have happen. But to have it happen twice is really, really cool. To have the Lord come back. You remember the first time he appeared, he asked Solomon, what do you want? What do you want, Solomon? And he said, give me wisdom. I don't want riches so much, but I want wisdom. I want to know how to govern these people here justly. And that blessed the Lord, his response. And not only did he give him wisdom, but he gave him massive amounts of wealth also. So now here he is appearing for him once again. And he's just reiterating the promise that he had made to David earlier in David's life. But when we get to verse 6, we see the other side of the coin. And it's very prophetic in its words. Let's go ahead and read it. It says, if your sons turn away from following me and do not keep my commands, my statutes that I have set before you, and if you go and serve other gods and bow and worship to them, I will cut off Israel from the land I gave them, and I will reject the temple I have sanctified for my name. Israel will become an object of scorn and ridicule among the people. Though this temple is now exalted, everyone who passes by will be appalled and will scoff. They will say, "Why did the Lord do this to this land and this temple?" And then they will say, "Because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of the land of Egypt. They held on to other gods, and they bowed in worship to them and served them. And because of this, the Lord brought all of this ruin on them." A warning to him, to the nation, and to us. The same kind of a warning, actually. God has given us great and precious promises. Promises that we won't truly realize until we are in God's presence, until we're there, until we see the fruition of all of these things. As a matter of fact, I think Paul said, it hasn't even entered into our imaginations, the things that God has planned for those who love him. That's a pretty cool thought, I mean, we get blessed and we get to do great things and we get to fellowship and love on each other and minister to people and we get to do all these wonderful things. But this is just a teeny little flick of what God has waiting for us when we finally find ourselves in his presence permanently. But this warning that he has given to Solomon here is so serious. And the sad thing about it is, it's not very long from now to where Solomon and his people are going to begin to forget. Now, when they first came into the land, when he first brought them out of Egypt, one of the things that they were to do was they were to go in and cleanse the land of all of those other people groups that were worshiping other gods. Now, before I knew very much about the Bible, and I would read things like that, I would think, well, that's really harsh. That's really rough, that you would go in and you want them to take out even the children and burn everything up and do all these horrible things. But we find out later on that there's a really important purpose for that, and God's trying to show us that these people groups, they weren't just worshiping an idol. They were doing horrible things, wicked things, a lot like what I was reading here to you. They were putting their children in the fire and sacrificing them to Baal, to the false gods, child sacrifice. They even got to the point where it got so corrupt that they had prostitutes set up in the temple so that men could go, and they also had male prostitutes so that men could go be with men. Kind of sounds like today in a lot of ways, doesn't it? But that's what happens when a person becomes debased and totally walks away from the things of God. That's the path. That's the ultimate destination for human beings apart from the knowledge of God and the good things of God. And so these people are being warned ahead of time, but they do not do what God asked them to do. They never eradicated the land. It'd be like you having a big old cancer tumor and you go into the doctor and he's, man, you got to have all of that removed if you want to survive. How about if we just take like 10% of it out? And leave the rest. It won't be a problem. I'll learn to live with it, right? That's stupid. Of course not. That would be a death sentence. That's exactly what these people did. They went into the land, they eradicated a lot of it, cleansed a lot of it, but they didn't finish the job. It just shows me, you know what? You got to finish the job. You can't be a half a Christian. You can't be half faithful. You can't walk in part of the light. You're either a saint or you ain't. One or the other, right? And the consequences of that type of behavior we see over and over and over again in the Word of God, and we see it in life in general. So verse 10 says, at the end of 20 years, during which Solomon had built 2 houses, the Lord's temple and the royal palace, King Hiram of Tyre, having supplied him with cedar and cypress logs and gold for his every wish, King Solomon gave Hiram 20 towns in the land of Galilee. So Hiram went out from Tyre to look over the towns that Solomon had given him, but he was not pleased with them. And so he said, what are these towns that you've given me, my brother? So he called them the land of Kabul, as they are still called today. Now Hiram had sent the king 9,000 pounds of gold to do construction on these structures, at the temple specifically. Kabul basically means worthless. You've given me all these slums. You've given me all this land that you can't even grow a thorn on. This is the thanks that I get. This is so, even here already we start seeing Solomon being a little bit of a trickster, not being totally forthright, not being totally ethical with this king who had done so much to help him. So he's not real happy about it. Hiram's pretty unhappy at this situation. And verse 15 says, this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon had imposed to build the Lord's temple, his own place, the supporting terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer, and then he burned it. He killed the Canaanites who lived in the city and gave it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon went and rebuilt Gezer, Lower Beth-horn, Baath Tamar, in the wilderness of Judah. All the storage cities that belonged to Solomon, the chariot cities, the cavalry cities, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, Lebanon, or anywhere else in the land of his dominion. Could you imagine building a whole city just to store your stuff? I'm going to build a city for all of our chariots. We'll build a city over here for all of our, whatever. Now look, here's the thing. In verse 20, we start to see part of the problem here that I was talking about earlier. As for all the people who remained, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, who were not Israelites, their descendants who remained in the land after them, those whom the Israelites were unable to destroy completely, Solomon imposed forced labor on them. And it is still that way to this day. But Solomon did not consign the Israelites to slavery. They were soldiers, his servants, his commanders, his captains, and commanders of his chariots and his cavalry. These were the deputies who were over Solomon's work, 550 who supervised the people doing the work. So who's doing the work? The people that are doing the work are the people that they were told to get rid of when they came into the land. But all of these people groups are still there. Quite a list. Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, mosquito bites, Jebusites, they're all there. Right? And they all have their own gods. They all have their own, quote, religious practices that's being bled into this nation of Israel and the people. Of course, the people, they had good jobs. They were supervisors. They were, commanders. They ran roughshod over all of these slaves. And I don't imagine that the slaves really had that great of a life. But as we might have mentioned, I think, last week, that a lot of the women of these people groups were very attractive, if you will, seductive. And to the men of Israel, they were very desirable. And so they have compromised and allow them to move into their homes and make them their wives and bring their false gods with them. And it just begins, like I mentioned cancer earlier, it just begins to get in there and grow. And there's only one outcome, unless it's treated. There's only one outcome, and that's death for a whole nation, which is an amazing thing. So here's some of Solomon's other activities in verse 24. Pharaoh's daughter moved from the city of David to the house that Solomon had built for her. And then he built the terraces. 3 times a year, Solomon would offer burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar that he had built for the Lord. And he burned incense with them in the Lord's presence. And so he completed the temple. So, do you remember what Saul did that displeased the Lord so much? When he was told to go and wipe out that group of people, the Amorites, or whatever, Ammon, and he did not. And he brought back the spoil, the booty, however you want to put it. And then the priest was going to come and do sacrifice, and it seemed like he was late. He was delayed, so what did Saul do? Saul assumed the position of the priest and began sacrificing animals, and then all of a sudden here comes Samuel showing up on the scene. What are you doing, Saul? You're not the priest. You're not the high priest. You don't have the authority to do this. You're the king, not the priest. Now, Solomon's doing the exact same thing. He's doing it 3 times a year. He's offering these burnt offerings. He's doing the high priest job. He's usurping the authority. Now, this is a big mistake. So we're starting to see these little things creep up in Solomon's rule over Israel. He's compromised with the people. He's done kind of a low-down real estate deal with Hiram. And now he's assuming that he can usurp the power of the high priest and offer all of these burnt offerings. That was not his place. He was out of place. And then King Solomon put together a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. With the fleet, Hiram sent his servants, experienced seamen, along with Solomon's servants, and they went to Ophir, and they acquired gold there, 16 tons of gold, and delivered it to Solomon. You would think, from looking at this, you would say, wow, God's really blessing them with all this gold and all these riches and all this great stuff that's going on, you know. But you have to also sit back and you got to go, well, wait a minute, man. Is that necessarily God's hand of blessing bringing about these things when Solomon is not being obedient as a king to what God asked him to do? You got to kind of wonder. Just because a group, a church, if you will, just because it's big, just because it's prospering, just because it has wealth, doesn't mean it's in God's will. As a matter of fact, the opposite is true many, many times. We've all seen that. We've all watched the begging that goes on from some of these groups. I remember even as far back as Jimmy Swaggart being on TV and weeping and telling everybody, if you don't send me money, I won't be on TV tomorrow. We'll have to close down our prayer ministry. Please send me money. Huge, massive, giant organization that most people would sit back at a distance and go, wow, what a man of God. Look what God has done. The guy's a used car salesman. The guy is manipulating people. He's making, and Paul warned us about this. I don't know which letter it was. In one of his letters, he said, watch out for these guys because they're going to come along and make merchandise out of you. They're going to come along for your buck. That's what they want. And so just because something is big and flashy and, appears to be so wonderful, it doesn't mean that God has blessed it or is blessing it. All of these giants, okay, we can look at this, and even many of them that it's still the same tactics going on today as it was back then. Manipulating people, begging people out of desperation. Maybe once in a while a guy should get a clue. Maybe God's telling me that he doesn't want this to become a giant. Maybe he doesn't want us to have all these riches and all this stuff. Maybe he just wants us to love him and serve him with pure hearts instead of having our focus on things and stuff. It really pulls you away from, when you hear a preacher get up and say that Jesus was wealthy and that you can be wealthy too. And people are desperate to hear things like that. They run. There was a guy, I can't remember his name right offhand, but he used to come on and he would prey on poor people, mainly African American people. And he was a white guy, but he was a healer preacher, right? He was a big farce, but he'd get them all excited and everything, and they'd be throwing their crutches up on the stage and dancing and all this. And people are, and he would say, hey, look, if you'll send me some money, I'll send you these colored pieces of silk. Popoff, that's him. Peter Popoff. Talk about a used car salesman, right? Prayer cloth. So I actually wrote to him. Yes, the water, that's right. And I was so intrigued by him that I actually wrote him a letter, and I said, look, I'm just a poor wee little pastor in Sheridan, Oregon. I can't afford to send you any money, but could you send me some of that water? I'd like one of those green pieces of cloth I put in my wallet and it turns into money. I know, we laugh.
I used to watch it because I was so fascinated by
The performance, right? But you know what? These men, they're deceiving God's people. Again, Paul said, hey, you want to be a leader? You want to be a teacher? You want to be a pastor? You better be careful what you say. You better make sure that you speak truth. And you better make sure, because you're going to have to answer to a higher authority one day. That's always been something as a pastor that's caused me to tremble, and I think, oh, God, help me to make sure that I don't say anything that would put me in that kind of a predicament as far as teaching out of the Bible. But it's easy now to see all these examples that we're talking about, how easy it is for people to get off track and get their attention onto something other than what their purpose is. Our purpose is to serve the Lord with all of our hearts. Our purpose is to love the unlovable. That's a hard thing to do, and you can't do that if the Holy Spirit's not alive and well in your life. Because the normal, natural man would point fingers. He would judge. He would be critical about it and say, why don't they clean up and go get a job? Or, well, whatever the criticism might be. Jesus never did that. Jesus never said that to anybody. The only people Jesus ever got angry at were the religious hypocrites. But he treated those who were lost with compassion. Over and over again, we've seen that on Sundays as we're going through Matthew. He looked on the multitude and he had compassion on them. And they were the same gullible kind of people that Solomon here has been asked to rule over in the name of God. So it's really a sad, sad story when you look at the human plight. We can't help it. It's what we are. We're sinners. We have it in our nature. And without guidance, without the word, we're lost. We're going down constantly. Maybe very slightly, but still going down nevertheless, right? Pastor Chuck used to say years ago, he would say, being a Christian is kind of like climbing a greased pole. And you got to keep working at it, man, because if you think you can stop and rest for a while, you're just going to start sliding back down. We always want to keep moving forward. We always want to keep working at it until our jobs are done. So let's look at chapter 10 here and get part of it read anyway. The Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon's fame connected with the name of the Lord and came to test him with riddles. Interesting. I wish I could have been there to hear that one. She came to Jerusalem with a very large entourage, with camels bearing spices, gold in great abundance, and precious stones. She came to Solomon and spoke to him about everything that was on her mind. So Solomon answered all of her questions. Nothing was too difficult for the king to explain to her. And when the king of Sheba observed all of Solomon's wisdom, and the palace that he had built, and the food at his table, his servants, his residents, his attendants, his service in their attire, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings that he offered at the Lord's temple, it took her breath away. Wow. This is the Queen of Sheba. It took her breath away. Just gives us kind of a little insight to what Solomon's kingdom was like. So she said to the king, "The report that I heard in my own country about your words and your wisdoms is true. But I didn't believe the reports until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, I was not even told half. Your wisdom and prosperity far exceed the reports I heard. How happy are your men? How happy are these servants of yours who always stand in your presence, hearing your wisdom? Blessed be the Lord your God. He delighted in you and put you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to carry out justice and righteousness." And then she gave the king 4.5 tons of gold, as though he was broke and he needed it. A great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again did such a quantity of spice arrive as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. And in addition, Hiram's fleet that carried gold from Ophir brought from Ophir a large quantity of almug wood and precious stones. The king made the almug wood into steps for the Lord's temple and the king's palace, and into lyres and harps, lyres, I suppose, for the singers. Never before did such almug wood arrive, and the like has not been seen again. So King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba her every desire, whatever she asked, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty, and then she, along with her servants, returned to her own country. Quite a visit, huh? Quite a PR move. Now, again, what we were talking about earlier, from all indications, the queen looked at Solomon and his world, and what did she say? God has blessed you abundantly. Because you have all this stuff, that must mean that God's on your side. Same kind of a human, normal response that most people would have. It's an amazing thing to think that it won't be very long in history before all of this is gone. before it's all carried away to other lands. Sometimes I think we find ourselves being a little bit filled with false pride, thinking that our wonderful United States of America, with all of its prosperity, will never change. It'll never be carried away. We'll never lose it. That's really a deceptive way to think, isn't it? But, you know, I mean, if you look at some of these other, like Rome and some of these other nations and countries, we're fledglings. We've only been around a little more than 200 years. How long did Rome last? Over 2,000 years? Something like that? Before they went down? So, and already we find ourselves at a very vulnerable position right now, a weakened position. So, I think because of our time, I'm going to stop there. Let me see how much I got left in this chapter. Let's finish the chapter, heck. So the weight of the gold that came to Solomon annually was 25 tons. Besides what came from the merchants, trader merchandise, and all the Arabian kings and governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 15 pounds of gold went into each shield. He made 300 small shields of hammered gold. Nearly 4 pounds of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a large ivory throne and overlaid it with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and there was a rounded top at the back of the throne, armrests on either side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, one at each end. Nothing like it had ever been made in any other kingdom. All of Solomon's drinking cups were gold. All the utensils in the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. There was no silver, since it was considered as nothing in Solomon's time, for the king had ships of Tarshish at sea with Hiram's fleet. And once every 3 years the ships of Tarshish would arrive bearing gold, silver, ivory, apes, interesting, and peacocks. King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the world in riches and in wisdom. The whole world wanted an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. Every man would bring his annual tribute, items of silver and gold, clothing, weapons, spices, horses, mules. Solomon accumulated 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and stationed them in the chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. And he made cedar as abundant as a sycamore in the Judean foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and Kue. The king's traders brought them from Kue at the going price, bought them. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 15 pounds of silver, and a horse for nearly 4 pounds. In the same way, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of Aram through their agents. So we got quite the strong economy going on here, right? The good life, if you will. I would say it was a little bit excessive, maybe. Don't know. Some would say, well, you know, he was God's guy, and if you're God's guy, that's the way you live, you know. I've always been really ever since we started this church, and, you know, some of you guys know and some of you don't, but this whole thing started with about 6 people in a cafeteria over at the school. About almost 16 years ago. And all I really thought was, maybe I'll just go over there and get a little group of people together and do a Bible study. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't know anybody. The only people I knew here were drug dealers and alcoholics. That's the only people I knew here. It was my destination for trouble for many, many years. But to sit back and to see what God's done in the last 15 years, all the lives that have passed through here, and God never, ever once has failed to provide for us as a church. Never. He's always given us and blessed us with more than enough. And here's the thing that blows my mind the most. I have never taken an offering here in 15 years. Never passed a plate. Never asked for a dime. Now, there's been times when we've had missionaries come, special speakers come, sponsoring people to go on a mission, things like that, where we would ask if you want to help out with that. But as far as supporting the church, not one time. That's because I believe in my heart, with all my heart, where God guides, God provides. To me, that's the fruit, the confirmation that we're where we're supposed to be. Because He's providing for us, and we don't need to be manipulators, beggars, scoundrels, or anything like that. So when you see, and you know what, the food thing, I was telling Ron, and by the way, everybody, this is Ron over here. Some of you know Ron, some of you haven't met him yet. Meet him before you leave, if you can. But I was telling him earlier about our food ministry. Now, Paul can tell you all about the food ministry because he's a big part of that. These guys are getting up. What time in the morning do you guys go pick up? 9. Every day to go get food, and bring it back and sort it out and put it away. All so that we can give it away on Thursday. Pretty amazing, huh? And, the idea of Jesus said, freely you have received, so what we do, we freely give, right? We take hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat to the Salvation Army in McMinnville because they hardly ever have meat to give out. They give out bread and oats and rice and your basic, we're taking them beef ribs and T-bone steaks and pork roasts and that lady over there, when we first started going over there, she just come out the door with tears in her eyes. She couldn't believe it that we were able to do that. And I kept telling her, man, this is God. This is God's hand. This is Him providing, and not just for our needs, but we get to push it out. Food Bank in Willamina, they get a lot of stuff from us. So I say all that just to encourage you guys that your prayers, your love for the Lord, your pure hearts before God, you're seeing the result of it around you when we see what God's doing. And beautiful thing about it is it's a team effort, right? It's all of us together doing our part. I've never viewed myself as the captain of the ship because it would have sunk a long time ago. I'm just in there with you all with an oar, and we're all rowing together. We all going to the same destination, right? We're all playing our roles that God has given us to do, and so let's stay faithful. Let's keep up the faith and keep loving on people, and He'll keep blessing us.
Sunday I saw a lot of young people come. That was beautiful.
We are seeing a lot more young people, and that's a real blessing. So I'm happy to see that. Why don't we go ahead and pray? Father, I want to thank you tonight for our time. And, as we study, continue looking at Solomon and, his life and just all the things that we're going to be encountering here in the next few weeks. Lord, help us to learn the deep spiritual truths that we need to know, lest we fall into the same trap, in the same pit. Lord, you have blessed us abundantly. We exalt your name. We give you the glory and the honor and the praise for it all. We thank you, Lord, that we can all work together in unity at this church with you. You're an awesome, awesome leader, and we thank you for that. So, Lord, as the week continues, Lord, help us to keep our minds fixed upon you, Lord, so that we won't sin against you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.